Hello and welcome to another edition of the GEB America podcast. I'm your co-host, Stephen Gunn, and I've got my friend and co-host, David Groves, with me here. And guys, we've got a special one today for you, and no lack of experience and stories and just wisdom of God's goodness. That's the one and only Russ Taff. Thank you so much for joining us, Russ. We sure appreciate it.
The views and opinions expressed on this program are solely those of the speakers and not necessarily those of GEB America, Oral Roberts University, or their employees. This program is not intended to offer investment, financial, medical, legal, or any other advice. Viewers should consult a subject matter professional regarding any such matters.
Thank you, guys. Stephen, David, thank you so much for letting me be on your show.
We're happy to have you. Coming to us from the beautiful location of Hot Springs, Arkansas, and it's a great little place over there, not too far down the road from us here in Tulsa. We're so happy to have you. And Russ, you've had a pretty incredible career in Christian music. So looking back, what was the moment that really first sparked that passion for music, and then how did faith play a role in that?
Well, it's interesting in this little town. Music in that little bitty Pentecostal church, music was such a part of it. And so I grew up, my mother was a singer, and really a quite wonderful singer, actually, and my grandmother. But when I was 15, we moved here. Dad had relapsed in California, and they voted him out of the church. And so there was a place, Dad would hold revivals every summer. He'd take off a month, and one of the stops was Hot Springs, Arkansas, and there's a little Pentecostal church where he would preach at. And when they voted him out of the church, and it was one of those things where, nobody would talk to us, and a lot of them in that church were family, and they just shunned us. So we moved here, and there was a little church here that allowed Dad to pastor. And me and two buddies, we would meet several times a week, about an hour before school, and just pray for the school. And that God would touch the students, that he would make us vessels and instruments to talk to students and stuff. And I was a pretty good singer at 17. And so one of the guys was a drummer and one of them was a bass player. Well, as an outreach, let's put a little band together.
Yeah.
But there was no contemporary music at all. We couldn't find it anywhere. And of course, back then, Dallas had a station, and Detroit had a station, and Philadelphia. So we started taking Beatles songs and rewriting them, and they were awful. I want to hold God's hand. I want to hold And I was after the principal for 2 months. Let us play an assembly. Let us play an assembly. And I went to my dad and I said, can we have a service at the church like a Monday night that none of the deacons and elders would come to? And he worked it out. And so we played in an assembly, and I invited the student body out to this little church in the country. And that first Monday, it was full. It was just full. And I knew 3 scriptures pretty well. And so I, for God so loved the world, and I gave an altar call, and the altars were full. Wow. And the next Monday night, it was more, and it just began to grow to where outside the church, 10 deep, we put speakers out there, and a real revival broke out in this town. We would play, I'm sitting by a park here that we used to play at as a teenager. But I didn't realize it was happening all over the country, on Costa Mesa, and that a real revival was swept. But we didn't know. We just thought God was, visiting Hot Springs, Arkansas, and hundreds were coming to Jesus. But we wanted to, about 2 years later, we wanted to introduce us, we had Southern gospel on this side, and then we were this screaming guitars and contemporary on that side. And so we promoted a show with the Imperials, just wanted to bring them in, just kind of something in the middle. And they let us do 20 minutes before they came on. And we did our 20 minutes, and then they did their show, and they invited us back up for the encore.
Oh, cool.
Well, the band broke up, and we were all 18, couldn't get along. So there was an evangelist that, his name was Jerry Savelle, and he invited me to Fort Worth. And I began to drive his van and set up the little PA system at the Holiday Inn banquet hall, and I began to travel with him. Well, I drove and he'd fly in and I'd go pick him up. But 2 years later, I was at his offices there getting ready to head out for another weekend, and I get this phone call from the Imperials, and they said, "We remember you. Would you want to come and try out?" But I didn't jump at it, because for the first time in my life, I was growing in the Lord and I was learning scripture, and he was like a spiritual dad to me. And it took me 3 weeks to decide to even drive to Nashville and try out. So I drove here, and they hired me that night.
Wow.
So
Nice.
within 3 weeks then, I was on the bus. It was like the largest crowd I ever sang to was 200 people. And the first night with the Imperials at Ball State University, there were 6,000 people. And I sang with my eyes closed. It scared me, man. It just scared to see that many people there. But that was kind of the start of the whole thing. They remember me from 2 years ago and wanted me to come and try out. And so that was the start of this whole thing.
That's amazing. And I think people often assume that every musician and person on stage loves being there. That's not always the case. There's phases and times where it's like you got to just step out in faith and go, okay, I don't know why I'm doing this. Close my eyes and just sing. You're right, and sing what God put in your heart, and just trust Him.
Yeah.
I guess, and is that right?
Well, and for a long time, I sang with my eyes closed because I was intimidated by the audience, and there were so many. And when I would open my eyes, it was always that, lady 4 rows back that threw her hands over her ears because it was too loud.
It was too loud.
So my wife, we got married the year I joined the Imperial. We'd been dating 2.5 years, but she was just encouraged me to follow this call on my life. So we got married that year, but she was after me constantly. Open your eyes, open your eyes, open your eyes. That you're shutting people out when you do that. But it took a while, and I realized that if I opened my eyes and I just looked above the audience, that I could make that work. But it took a while for me just to settle into it and stand on that stage and sing to people and not be intimidated or afraid of them.
That's amazing. So you had a time there with the Imperials, legendary Imperials, for about 5 years, and then what went into the decision making of, the solo, doing your first solo album, and kind of that foray into the 80s where you had several really great solo projects?
Well, with the Imperials, we had finished the second record with Michael Omartian called Priority. I was a salaried employee and no royalties, nothing. So, and I kept singing more and more and more of the solos because my voice fit the contemporary style that they were moving toward. And, but there was no incentive to stay. I mean, Jim and Armin owned the group. And so they were buying bigger Mercedes and bigger houses. And so I talked to Armin and I said, can you give me, a little bit of royalties, just some incentive to stay? But he was old school, and this was years ago, and he stretched his arm out and he took his hand and put it on his shoulder, and he said, I got a list of guys this long that would take your place in a heartbeat. Oh. And so I realized there's no advancement here. But I'd always wanted to make my own music and my own writing and that sort of thing. So I decided, Tori and I prayed, and it's like, okay, it's time to step out in faith and do what God called me to do. But it was scary. I mean, everybody knew the Imperials and they knew the songs, but my name, I was just one of the 4 guys. And so it was a real step out of faith that, sink or swim, I know God's called me to do this. And it was 2 years before the first record came out. Omartian was supposed to produce it, but he had produced that record for Christopher Cross, Sailing Takes Me Away. And he was under contract with Warner Brothers, and we had already been in post-production meetings and song and all that. And he said, Russ, they're demanding that I do the second Christopher Cross record, and which was huge. And so he introduced me to Bill Schnee, and we started the project, but it was, it took 2 years to get this thing and get it out. So I lived on 90-day loans where I would, take out a loan and give the band and stuff money so we could go out on the road, and I'd come back and pay the loan off. And within 3 months, I had to take out another loan, and that went on for 2 years until the first record came out, and we actually started making enough money to make payments on the transportation and fuel and all of that. But it was a long process. But I was so fortunate and blessed that first solo project won a Grammy. And so it just kind of really established me as a solo artist. And it was a good record. I mean, Walls of Glass, it was really, really a good record and just great players on it and great songs. So, I knew that it was the right decision to leave, even if I fell flat on my face. But there's times, and you guys too, guys, there's just times you got to step out. And God says move, and you just got to trust him and go. So that started the whole solo career.
So you had the follow-up album after that did really well.
Medals, yeah.
Which is the one that I think a lot of people are most familiar with.
Yeah,
I wore out at least 2 cassettes of Walls of Glass. So, but the Medals album was the one where I first became aware of you in the mid '80s. And then, so you talked about the different albums that came through after that. Were there any musicians or collaborations during that period that you really just that stand out to you, that you really had a really just an incredible time with? Anybody musicians or producers you enjoyed working with more than others, maybe?
Well, that first solo project and Medals and the self-titled record, we were using the best players in LA that played on everybody else's stuff. And I remember, one of the tracking sessions that we did for Walls of Glass, I walk in and there's Jeff Porcaro on drums. And he was the drummer for Toto and, Michael Landau, and these were and James Newton Howard. I mean, these guys were all great session players, and it's kind of funny because it was my first solo project. So I'd really scoped the songs that I'd written and stuff like that. And I want the bass to do this, and I want the guitar to do that, yada, da, da. And so the smartest thing I ever did in that first tracking section was just keep my mouth shut. And because when these guys started playing, it was like, oh my God, I did not know music could sound this good. And Nathan East and all of these great, great players. But, some of them were Christians. And Robbie Buchanan became a Christian. He was working on my project, and Amy Grant's. And so just being around Christians had a real impact on his life. Yeah. And he gave his heart to the Lord. So, it was just a great time of, seeing people, and those that were ministered to, those that were around us, and in the studio, there was a Word Records and stuff back then with me and Amy and Michael, all of it, but they gave us a whole lot of money, just a whole lot of money to make these records. But, the musicianship was just stunning. I mean, just stunning. And we carried the banner of Jesus. I didn't back up about my faith or anything, but I also respected them like crazy. And then when I started singing, they respected me. So there was just a great, they listened to me. They heard my voice, they heard my talent, and they knew that I was serving Jesus and the lyrics of the song. And but it was just a great time of witnessing. And, most of them loved Jesus, but that had a problem with the church. Mm-hmm. The church had told them, you're playing rock and roll music or whatever, right. and kind of turned their back on them. And, they were turning LA and the world upside down with their musicianship. But so when they saw just a guy that just loved Jesus and was talented and didn't preach to him, he just lived, we all know that saying of St. Francis, preach the gospel, and if you have to, use words.
Right.
So, but there were great moments in the studio. There were just great moments of praying in the studio. There's a song on Medals that was called Knock on a Bow. And we wrote that in the studio. We had some downtime in Ocean Way, and James Newton Howard, who just does movies anymore, he just does slews of movies, and Michael Landau, and we wrote the music to Not Gonna Bow. And before I started working on the lyric, he was wanting to give that track to Toto. And I said, no way, man, this is going on. So Tori and I wrote the lyric to Not Gonna Bow. But I don't know. These guys were open and honest. They were real guys, not a lot of egos at all. And so, but those were just incredible times tracking in the studio. It's funny. I'd never been around drugs at all. I had just never been around drugs or anything like that at the time. And it was like 11 o'clock at night, and we had been tracking all day. I'd never been around cocaine. I didn't know what it was, didn't know anything about it. And so we had been tracking all day, and everybody was tired. And about 11 o'clock at night, James Newton Howard and Jeff Porcaro stepped outside. And I thought, well, they're just stepping outside, maybe a smoke break or something like that. And when they came in, they were wiping their noses. And they said, let's cut it again. Let's track it again. I was like, what? We're all exhausted. And they just went out and took a hit of cocaine, and they were ready to go again. And somebody had to pull me aside. Russ, that's cocaine. What is cocaine? Well, it speeds you up like crazy. So that was my first encounter with musicians doing cocaine.
Wow. Well, you mentioned the song kind of that stood out to you over time. Your song, We Will Stand, particularly has become kind of an anthem of the unity for Christians everywhere. What inspired that song? And then kind of what message of unity do you hope that it brings, to those currently today?
Well, it is such a timeless message for today. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and that time, it was 83, and there was a whole lot of racism going on in Nashville. It got violent, and it was that thing, we all bleed red, but because of the skin color, that, there's a big divide between white and black, and everybody was screaming at each other. And also at the time, I would go into a Baptist church, and none of the Pentecostals would come. I'd go into a Methodist church, and none of the Baptists would come. And it was just born out of that, of like, if we pull together, we can shake this world.
Yeah.
But it was about 4 in the morning, and I wrote the chorus, and I ran up and woke Tori up, and I said, listen to this. And he goes, well, we'll work on it tomorrow. And I said, no, let's do it
now.
So it was like 11 o'clock the next day that we actually started hammering out the lyrics to it. But that's one of the songs that it's still, just one of the most requested that I get. So, that was a real big moment for me as a writer. I remember a few years later, I'd never heard an audience sing back to me my lyric. And we were in Six Flags Over Texas, and it was about 6,000 people in the audience, 7,000, something like that. And I went into that song, and when it hit the chorus, they all started singing back to me.
Wow.
And so I stopped singing. The band kept playing, and it was just overwhelming to hear these people sing back a lyric that you wrote, and then just people talking about that song and what it meant to them. But that was my first time for a lyric that Tori and I wrote that they sang back to you. As an artist, that's just a thrill when that happens.
That's awesome.
I bet it is.
So I know, Russ, you've been through some personal struggles. You've been very transparent over the years about that, including your journey with sobriety. A lot of people listen to the podcast from all around the world, and I'd love for you to just kind of talk about how overcoming those challenges has deepened your relationship with God. Because just in this talking with you here, we certainly could tell that you very much keep Him the center of what you do. What does that look like, and how's that impacted your music?
Well, growing up in church, but in that house where we lived, that constantly, daily, you're not worth the bullet to shoot you with, you're not worth the salt on your bread, and you will never amount to anything, daily. And after a while, you start saying it to yourself, I'll never amount to anything. But then you win a Grammy, and there's all this celebration and joy, and then you go back to the hotel, and within 45 minutes, the joy is gone, and they gave this to the wrong person, and I don't deserve this. And And I was just always tortured by, you're standing in front of thousands of people, and I don't belong here. I'm not that good. I'll never amount to anything. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I was in New York. Tori's brother played with the New York Philharmonic, and I'd never been to New York. And so drinking was like a big taboo, in the sense of, like, I'd play golf, and two guys at the church, when we'd finish 18, they'd have a Bud Light and go home, and I'd have a Coke. But I never drank because of my dad. My dad was a Pentecostal preacher and an alcoholic. So, I was alone Tori was at Bloomingdale's, and her brother was in rehearsal with the Philharmonic, and I was alone in the apartment, and it was fifth floor in the Village in July. And so I just opened a Heineken and just drank way out of Coke. And I hated the taste of it. But there wasn't like this giant taboo like he's having a beer. Like I said, my pastor had wine with dinner, and it wasn't. But within 5, 6, 7 minutes, I began to feel something. And those voices got quieter. And then I had the second one, and the voices got quieter. And by the third one, I lifted my hands and I began to worship God. Those voices were gone. And I said, I can live this way. This must be the way normal people feel, that those voices aren't always going on in my head. I mean, you write a song, it should have been better, and no matter what success you got, it was never good enough to fill that hole, because you're just not good enough. And like I said, I lifted my hands and began to worship God, that I can live this way. There's no guilt. There's none of this stuff. And not really realizing within 3 or 4 months that this thing would get a hold of me. And I had the same gene as my dad, that I was prone for alcoholism. And it started a road that just led me into hell. First of all, you can't tell anybody. You're afraid to let anybody in. You're going to be judged. And so I held it as a secret. And it just, I don't know. Then you're talking about hating yourself. I turned into my dad, and you're standing in front of people, and you're talking about Jesus, and you mean every word of it. You mean every word of it. But you could not wait till it was over to go turn your head off again. So I go to treatment, and I got sober, and went out on tour, and I did real good. I was sober for 10 years. But there was so much unresolved trauma from my childhood. I mean, stuff happened in that home that should not have happened, and calling yourself a preacher and doing, I mean, it just, so I'm standing at the casket, and he's my dad, you're supposed to love him, but I had so many resentments against him, just, and unresolved stuff and I wanted it to go away. I wanted it to go away so bad, and I knew that if I bought a fifth of whiskey within 20 minutes, it's all gone. But I blew my house up again. I blew everything up again. And I had to go back to square one, and went back to treatment. And got a hold of it, and, making good progress in 9 years sober. And Mom dies. And it's the same thing. Of like, there's this pain, this heart, soul pain of, why didn't she leave? Why did she let this happen? And and I wound up relapsing again. But therapists I was seeing at the time, of course, way back then, you didn't talk about therapists, you didn't talk about antidepressants, you didn't talk about anything. But she told me, she said, Russ, until you deal with the trauma of your childhood, you're never going to stay sober. Every time a family member dies, you're going to relapse. So she sent me to this place called Life Healing Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it was deal with trauma. And I spent 35 days there, and it's amazing what they did inside of me. They built this filter. When I first got there, they said, okay, draw a picture of your higher power. You're going to need him while you're here. And so I drew this stick figure of Jesus. I can't draw. And for 2 weeks in group sessions, there was like 6 therapists for 20 people. It was real intense. And after a couple of weeks, they said, bring your picture of Jesus. You're going to need him today. And they pulled up a chair beside me and they put my picture of Jesus, and they led me down to my very first memories. And all the way I describe it is there was like this car is like full of gum wrappers, which were memories. And they would run it through this filter that they had built inside of me, and I'd lay it down on the other side of me. And this went on for 3 weeks, because memories then would bring up other memories, and I cried for 3 weeks. But when I finished, there was no more resentment or anger or hurt or angst at anyone or anything. And when I left there, I was a different person. I mean, just flat out a different person. But, you know, I went home back to Nashville a different man, a completely different man. And I've been sober 20 years. But there's so many people, you know, Dottie Rambo wrote a song as he looked beyond my faults and saw my needs. And I think so many times we look at someone and we judge them, not knowing the backstory, not knowing what caused them to be that way in the first place. I mean, you know, you see a prostitute on the street and you condemn her, but you don't realize 99% of prostitutes were molested as children. And it's so easy to look at somebody and judge them, but you don't know what caused them to get there. But anyway, that I had no idea how much peace you could live in, how much joy. I mean, I love my wife more now than I ever have. It's just, I don't know, at this age and everything else, that I love life. I love Jesus. I love singing about him. I love talking about him. And, but anyway, it's a world that I love. And going out now there's so much joy. I mean, just so much joy to sing and talk about Jesus and to tell people about the miracle that happened. And I tell people, it was like last weekend, you know, I've done everything musically I ever wanted to do. There's nothing untapped as far as musical things I wanted to do. Yeah. But I go out now to tell the story of no matter where you are in your life, no matter what's going on, Jesus will get right down into the mud. And he will help get you out of there, and he brushes you off, he washes you off, and he makes you new. He forgives your sin, and he makes you a new person. So these days when I go out, it's just to talk about him. And I sing all the hits and that sort of thing, but there's always 15 minutes of my program that I talk about going into what happened and the trauma and everything else and how Jesus brings you out. But anyway, these years have just been incredible, these last 20 years. I love my wife now more than I ever have. And she thinks I'm pretty cool, too, now.
So awesome. Well, so a quick question for you about the recent days here and what you've been doing. Tell us about this new project, this new cover. You talked
cover
about
story.
Everything you've had to do, you've done. Well, now you've done a cover album. And that's pretty cool. Tell us about that, what went into that. That's where I kind of first became familiar with what you were doing with this album and connected with some friends of yours in the industry, and they reached back out to us, and I said, hey, we want to have him on the podcast to talk about this new album. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, Chagall Guevara, you know, the big band in the 80s, Steve Taylor, and they did a concert at the Ryman, 30-year anniversary. And then the next night, they had kind of like an afterglow at the Blue Room, which is Jack White's studio there in Nashville. And it's like this performance room. And Ashley Cleveland came out to do a song, and Kevin Max, and some more of us. And I was supposed to do Down in the Lowlands with Charlie Peacock, you know, that song off the self-titled record. And Charlie got sick and he couldn't come, and I was just going to stand and enjoy. The band was this great blues band, and and Jimmy Abegg, who had worked with Steve Taylor for a while, he came to me and he said, well, let's do it just you, but let's do it more blues. And, you know, when you get an old seasoned pro like me, you don't care if you fall flat on your face or not. You don't even prove anymore. And so we went into Lowlands. And they started throwing solos around, back and forth, the guitar players and that sort of thing. And Jimmy Abegg looked at me and goes, get out there and do something. And I said, what? He said, I don't know, get out there and do something. So if I fall flat on my face, I mean, these people know me, but I stepped out there and I just started ad-libbing, and then I started singing like a Pentecostal preacher, and the place just goes crazy. And you can't duplicate it. You can't. It was just one of those nights. And when I walked off the stage, the guys came up to me, Dave Perkins and Lynn Nichols and John Painter, and they said, "We got to make a record on you. We got to make a record." And Steve was there, and there was a guy there that said, "I'll help fund it."
Oh, wow.
And me and John Painter and Steve got together, and we just started picking songs that we all like, and from Depeche Mode and Duran Duran and Prince and U2, and we came up with 11 songs that are covers, and we did two. One's an old worship. Well, both of them are pretty old worship songs. So there's two worship songs on the record, but the rest of it is just covers. Not Christian. They're just, one of them is 1916, Tear This Building Down, that Robert Johnson and Blind Willie Johnson recorded. And Mama had that record when I was a kid. And then there's a Bill Witherton called Grandma's Hands but we worked on it. And people started getting little glimpses of it, and there's like this whole buzz going on in Nashville. And Steve Taylor said, "Well, let's start a Kickstarter so we can promote this thing." And I was thinking maybe, $20,000 or whatever. And Steve said, "Well, let's go for it. Let's go for 100,000." And I panicked. And it was like, dear Lord. But within 28 days, we reached $100,000, and they're going to go after this big time marketing. But it's going to come out in January. But it's probably one of the best things I've done since the 80s. I mean, it's one of those records that, when everything is said and done, I'll look back and go, man, that's one of the ones that's going to live for a long, long time. But it's a stellar record, like I said. And the way I sang, the arrangements, everything is just incredible. And I'm not saying that lightly. It's like it is one of the best things I've ever done.
Yeah, to our listeners, there are some links in the show notes. There's been some videos released and some things you guys have been doing marketing wise, and we've got those there for our listeners to listen to. And then you could find out more information on how to in advance get more information about the album. And that's essentially how we ended up reaching out. I saw a video that Steve Taylor did promoting it. And I was like, I want to totally. Me and some of the other guys that work here, we go way back in radio and live performance days, and so we definitely were interested in that. And then I reached out and said, hey, let's talk about the new album, but let's talk about Russ and his career. We have that opportunity, and so we're looking forward to. I know there's going to be a vinyl for collectors. It just looks so good.
That's awesome. What looking ahead? What's coming up? Anything else on the horizon? Any other projects you're working on right now?
Well, right now, I mean, I go out and do regular concerts. I do like 2 a month. I'll go out. But this last year, I have toured, and overhead was so high and that sort of thing. And there's so many things I couldn't do. But these last 8 months, once a month, I'll pick a church, a small church, and I'll go in for free. I'll pay my own way, pay my own hotel, pay my own gas, and I'll minister at that church for free. And that has been so rewarding, just so rewarding for me to go in, the story, the gift, the songs, and just give it as a tithe. But I'm really getting off on that. I just feel God's presence when I do that. So I'm going to continue to do that around everything else too.
That's wonderful.
That's awesome.
That's a special.
Well, we want to thank you for taking time in your travels here in Hot Springs, Arkansas today to come on the podcast and talk to us a little bit. And I know you've had quite the journey, and God continues to do amazing.
Yes, He does.
And
yes,
we look
does.
forward to the new album. when it comes out online and available in CD and vinyl form as well. And if you go to Russ Taff's website, I have the links there as well on the show notes. So again, thank you, Russ, for coming on the show. For Stephen Gunn, I'm David Groves, and we appreciate you being here on the GEB America podcast. Remember, at GEB, we drop a new podcast episode every Tuesday, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for being here.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.